From the author of Spinsterella, The Strange and Unusual Romance and Spellbound, A Darker Shade of Black comes the legendary Magic Children. Pick up the conclusions of the Spinsterella trilogy in paperback and e-readers this Halloween. One of the great contradictions regarding Marvel Comics' recent diversity campaign is the lack of diversity behind the scenes when it relates to employees at Marvel Comics. Now, Marvel Comics has been touting its new diversity heroes like its female Wolverine, its female Thor, its Asian Hulk, its black female Iron Man, and its black Captain America and its black Spider-Man. However, once we get behind the scenes at Marvel Comics, we really don't see that much diversity. Now, when it comes down to all these diversity campaigns that some companies have, they oftentimes wind up talking about diversity, and then they try to game the system by not hiring a qualified African American, Latino, or Asian. What they will do is they'll go out here and hire a white woman. And when they hire that white woman, what they will do is try to game the system by saying they hired a woman, and because they hired a woman, they have met the standard for diversity. And when it comes down to that standard of diversity, that's a disingenuous standard. And when I look at Marvel Comics and all the white females they have hired, it clearly shows me how disingenuous they are about actual diversity. Because when it comes down to many of those white females that they hired, many of them are grossly unqualified, and many of them do not meet the standard for being a qualified individual who is qualified to work in comics. Now, when I look at Marvel Comics' past history of hiring people of color, they oftentimes did hire people who did meet the qualifications for working in comics and met the same standard as everyone else as related to working on a comic book. When I look at artists like your Ron Wilson, who worked on Marvel 2-in-1 back in the day, and I look at guys like Keith Pollard, who worked on Amazing Spider-Man, Thor, and Fantastic Four, clearly their work met a standard at Marvel Comics as related to being able to draw art that conveyed a story. And when it came down to guys like Mark D. Bright, who was a celebrated artist who worked on Iron Man during the Armor Wars, he met a high standard on that comic as well. And when we look at guys like Dwayne McDuffie, who learned the business at Marvel Comics as an intern and then further went up as he started out on smaller titles and then had the limited series Damage Control, which he wrote, he clearly showed that he mastered his craft as he worked at Marvel Comics. Not to mention women like Ann Nocenti, who worked on Daredevil, and women like Marie Severin, who worked on many titles at Marvel back in the early days of Marvel. Everyone who came into Marvel during the early days and up to about the 80s and early 90s had to learn the business, and they had to show that they met the standard for meeting the standard skills and mastering a craft. When I look at today's attempts at diversity at Marvel Comics, it's clear to me that there's not really any serious attempt at real diversity, because a serious attempt at real diversity would be meant with trying to recruit talented individuals who met the basic qualifications for a writer, the basic qualifications for a penciler, the basic qualifications for an editor, and the basic qualifications for meeting the standards for skills. When I look at a lot of Marvel Comics these days, yes, you have creators of color like Ta-Nehisi Coates working there, but they clearly do not meet the standard for what makes a great Marvel comic. Your Ta-Nehisi Coates and your Gabby Rivera produce some of the worst comics at Marvel, and they're clearly there because they are just a basic African American or a basic Hispanic, but they don't have any specialized skills that allow them to meet a standard for creating quality comics. And that shouldn't be at one of the top publishers in comic books. If you're serious about diversity, you think Marvel's editors would be walking around the floor on the artist alley going to try to talk to some of these African American artists who are at the Comic-Con and trying to ask them if they would want to come in and do a tryout story, or to try to work on a guest penciling gig or something like that, where they would be coming into the industry, because there are plenty of African American artists out there who would love to have an opportunity, to work at Marvel Comics, and they would love to have that opportunity to show what they can contribute in terms of skill and in terms of talent. Unfortunately, when it comes down to Marvel's editors, they're not very genuine about real diversity, because if you were really genuine about diversity, you would be in that artist alley at the middle of the day trying to network with many of these black artists, many of these Hispanic artists, because I see them at Comic Cons, and these guys are looking for an opportunity to show what they can do, but they are not given an opportunity to show what they can do because of the racism that has permeated the comic book industry for many years. Because when it comes down to the comic book industry, that's something they don't want to talk about, is how they limit opportunities for creators of color. Creators of color want to contribute to Marvel Comics, they want to work at Marvel Comics, but they find themselves up against a brick wall because the editors at Marvel Comics don't like the idea of hiring African American creators or Latino creators, because the whole idea of having a person of color like that on one of these comics, I don't know, they're not comfortable with that idea of having a black person or a Hispanic person, even though many of these artists that I mentioned, like your Mark D. Bright, your Ron Wilson, and your Keith Pollard, produced rock solid work. And then I look on the DC side, guys like Daryl Banks had an amazing run on the Kyle Rayner Green Lantern. I mean, nobody knew that Kyle Rayner, in the first couple of 50 to from Green Lantern 50 to about 75, or even before then, like Green Lantern 48 of Volume 2, was all drawn by a black man, and that Daryl Banks helped create Kyle Rayner's iconic crab mask costume, and he had a major part in that. Nor do they know about Daryl Banks' work on indie books like Justice Machine. So this Daryl Banks had a big career, and a lot of people didn't even know it was a black guy drawing Green Lantern. Nor did they know that, Keith Pollard drew Spider-Man, and he helped co-create the Black Cat, one of Spider-Man's major villains, in his Rogues Gallery. A lot of these black creators have done a lot for the comic book industry, but they don't get the respect that they deserve, nor do black artists get the opportunities to work in the comic book industry to make contributions like guys like Keith Pollard and Daryl Banks and many others have made to the comic book industry. And I look at this comic book industry, which talks about diversity, and it's really, again, the disingenuousness at Marvel is something that is really something I really can't stand, because for them to say they're going to have these characters of color up front and then not try to hire people to work behind the scenes of color, that shows me, again, how disingenuous and how dishonest they truly are. Because if you're really serious about diversity, you would not be out here hiring white women. You'd be out here hiring black men, Hispanic men, and Asian women to work at comics. Because one of the reasons why I believe the comic book industry is in the dire straits it's in right now is because we don't see qualified creators of color working at Marvel Comics or DC Comics. And because those qualified creators of color can't get in the door, they can't bring new and fresh ideas to these comics, and that's why the whole industry is stagnating. Because if those creators of color could come in, maybe they could do something like what Daryl Banks did in creating Kyle Rayner's iconic crab mask and gauntlets for his costume that a whole generation of readers saw as Green Lantern. Or they could come in like Keith Pollard did and co-create a character like Black Cat, who became a major part of Spider-Man's world. Because those creators of color have new and fresh ideas, but they can't get in due to this whole disingenuousness regarding diversity. Because if you were really about diversity, you would be trying to bring in, again, those qualified creators of color who are at every Comic-Con, having tables there and looking for work, and all these qualified people who clearly can make a contribution to the industry and can bring in an audience of people to help bring in those new readers that the industry desperately needs. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct titles like the ISIS series and the E-Steam series, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.